El aplauso más orgulloso. El consejo más sincero. El abrazo más caluroso. El apoyo incondicional. El momento más divertido. La escuela más didáctica. Y el hogar sin igual. Eso y más es la familia. Formemos familias y fortalezcamos a nuestra gran familia, la sociedad. Núcleo familiar.
Buenas noches a todos los que se encuentran con nosotros. Nos da mucho gusto que nos acompañen. Bienvenidos y gracias por estar conectados el día de hoy. Hoy tenemos como conferencista a Leonard Sax, psicólogo y médico familiar, autor de 4 libros para padres y experto expositor internacional en temas de desarrollo infantil y adolescente. Agradecemos su tiempo y las reflexiones que nos compartirá el día de hoy. Antes de comenzar, me voy a tomar unos minutos para platicarles a toda la gente nueva que tenemos hoy conectada qué es Núcleo Familiar. Núcleo Familiar es una asociación civil sin fines de lucro que se formó hace casi 4 años, donde buscamos generar contenidos positivos para ayudarnos a todos como sociedad a formar familias fuertes en Monterrey y en México. Esto lo hacemos a través de contenidos positivos, sencillos, prácticos y útiles en formato impreso y digital, por medio de nuestra revista Aventura Familiar, el panfleto Don Salpicón, que busca llegar al sector vulnerable de nuestra sociedad, la Familiateca, que son artículos para toda la familia dentro de nuestra página web, y Señalética, que son frases en lugares públicos donde se enaltecen los valores familiares. También compartimos nuestro contenido en formato de video y en audio, a través de nuestros podcasts todos los lunes y spots radiofónicos, en forma presencial o virtual, como el caso de esta conferencia. Los invitamos a ver las conferencias que hemos tenido a lo largo de este tiempo junto a grandes expositores. Las puedes encontrar dentro de nuestro canal de YouTube, Núcleo Familiar. Queremos agradecer a nuestros patrocinadores que han creído en la importancia de la causa y han confiado en Núcleo Familiar como la plataforma para juntos formar familias fuertes y hacer posible este tipo de conferencias. También queremos agradecer a todas las cuentas de influencers que difundieron esta conferencia a través de sus redes sociales. Cada vez somos más aportando de diferentes maneras a esta causa y a la sociedad. Por último, también agradecemos a nuestros inversionistas sociales conformados por el Consejo Directivo y hoy en día por los 380 donantes de Núcleo Familiar, con aportaciones recurrentes mensuales. Muchísimas gracias. Sin más preámbulo, los dejamos con Leonard Sax y su conferencia titulada Why Gender Matters. Bienvenido, Leonard.
Well, I want to begin by thanking my hosts in Monterrey for giving me this opportunity to meet with you. I want to share what I've learned about girls and boys over my 35 years as a medical doctor. A little word about my background. I earned my undergraduate degree at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I then earned my doctorate in psychology and my medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. I am a medical doctor. I'm practicing, and this is my day off. Started visiting schools 20 years ago. I've now visited over 460 schools over the last 20 years. I've written 4 books. Why Gender Matters is going to be the focus of our time together today. Boys Adrift, Girls on the Edge, and The Collapse of Parenting, which is also available in Spanish translation. So let's go ahead. Let's begin with the data. Any talk about girls and boys needs to be grounded in data, in research. So I want to begin with studies, and there's about 12 of these studies, 12 different studies that have been published, all of which have roughly the same format. In each of these studies, researchers gave young children, 3, 4, 5, 6 years of age, a choice of playing between a doll and a truck. A doll, a stereotypical girl's toy, a truck, stereotypical boy's toy. What happens when you give young children a choice of playing with a girl toy or a boy toy? Well, here's one of these studies. Sharon Berenbaum and Melissa Hines published this research. Uh, these are girls, these are boys. Gray is the amount of time spent playing with the colorful doll, and black is the amount of time spent playing with the dull gray truck. Young girls spend more time playing with the doll than they do playing with the truck, but there's quite a lot of variation among the girls. Boys spend almost all their time playing with the dull gray truck and very little time spent playing with the doll. This is not a new finding. I first encountered one of these studies, 40 years ago, when I was a student in the doctoral program at the University of Pennsylvania, earning my doctorate in psychology. I took a graduate seminar in developmental psychology with the late Justin Ehrenfried. And he presented these findings and he asked, why is this? Why do girls, excuse me, girls tend to play with dolls rather than trucks, and boys overwhelmingly play with trucks rather than dolls? He said it's because of the social construction of gender. Professor Ehrenfried said, we teach girls to behave like girls, we teach boys to behave like boys, and by 3 years of age, the kids have figured it out, so you give them a choice. The girls choose the dolls somewhat more than they choose the trucks, but he said we send a much stronger message to boys that a boy should never play with a doll. So going back to that graph, the boy picks up the doll and drops it like a hot potato. There's very little variation amongst the boys. It's all because of how we raise them. This was the traditional explanation 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and I did not question it. I don't know of anyone really who questioned it back in the 80s and 90s. I don't think you can resolve this question of whether these differences are nature or nurture if you look only at studies involving humans. You have to look beyond humans. Gerianne Alexander and her colleagues at Yale were the first to ask this question of a non-human primate, of monkeys. They gave juvenile monkeys a choice of playing with dolls or trucks, and their findings have subsequently been replicated by Kim Wallen and his colleagues studying a different species of monkey in Atlanta, as well as Richard Wrangham and his colleagues observing chimpanzees. Here are the monkey data. The female monkey slightly, but not significantly, prefers to play with a doll rather than a truck. The male monkey significantly prefers to play with a dull gray truck rather than a doll. You can try to invoke the social construction of gender to explain these findings. You would have to assert that the monkey in authority is saying something like, now son, don't let me get you playing with no doll. But this does not happen. The researchers who've done this work say that the monkeys in authority are paying no attention to the choices made by the juveniles. It makes no difference whether you conduct the study in isolation or in the colony. You cannot plausibly invoke the social construction of gender to explain the finding that juvenile male monkeys greatly prefer to play with a dull gray truck rather than a colorful doll. You can invoke the social construction of gender to explain the difference across species. Here are the results with monkeys. Here are the results with humans. The main effect, which is the preference of the juvenile male to play with a dull gray truck rather than a colorful doll, is more pronounced in humans than in monkeys. Why is that? Well, researchers have asked that question. And the answer they give is that the social construction of gender exaggerates the hardwired difference. Or in the words of Dr. Melvin Conner at Emory University in Atlanta, culture stretches biology. Culture stretches biology. The main effect, the preference of the juvenile male to play with a dull gray truck rather than a colorful doll, must be hardwired, must be innate, because it is found in 4 primate species, humans, chimpanzees, and 2 species of monkey. It is more pronounced in our species than in monkeys because of the social construction of gender, because the social construction of gender exaggerates and exacerbates this hardwired difference. All right, that's plausible, but we still have not accounted for the main effect. Why is it the case that juvenile males, whether human, chimpanzee, or monkey, greatly prefer to play with a dull gray truck rather than a colorful doll? Gerianne Alexander was the first to document that finding in a non-human primate, and she was also the first to propose a plausible explanation. And it is her explanation that many parents have found very useful, and teachers as well, in working with girls and boys, in raising girls and boys. So I think it's worth a minute to understand Professor Alexander's hypothesis. To understand what Professor Alexander is saying, you must first recall what you learned about the human visual system, which is the same visual system we find in monkeys and chimpanzees. You recall the rods and cones, the photoreceptors in the retina that convert light into a signal the brain can understand. The rods are black and white sensitive, and they're all throughout the retina. The cones come in three varieties, red, green, and blue, and they're concentrated at the center of the field of vision. The next layer in the retina are the ganglion cells, and they take that information from the rods and the cones and begin to process it. There are basically two kinds of ganglion cells: the little cells that take information only from the cones, and the big cells, the magnocellular ganglion cells that collect information from the rods and a little bit from the blue cones. Researchers have known for more than 30 years now, since Leslie Unkelleider and her colleagues demonstrated there are two visual systems in the brains of all higher primates, human, chimpanzee, and monkey. One visual system arises from the little ganglion cells, and it's answering the question, what? What is it? What is its color? What is its texture? The other visual system arises from the big ganglion cells, and it's answering the question, where? Where is it going? How fast is it moving? That's not news. That's been established in neuroscience for more than 30 years. Gerianne Alexander was the first, and we need to look at some of this evidence for the two visual systems. Pascal Rakic and his colleagues at Yale mapped out the human visual system, tracing the flow of information from the little ganglion cells in the retina to the P, or parvocellular division of the lateral geniculate nucleus in the thalamus, and then onto Brodmann area 17 and human occipital cortex. Likewise, the big ganglion cells send their information to the M, or magnocellular division of lateral geniculate nucleus, and then onto HOC5, area 5 of human occipital cortex. Gerianne Alexander was the first to argue that the M system greatly predominates in males, and the P system slightly predominates in females. Now, when she first made that argument in 2003, it was a guess, a conjecture. But over the last 18 years, we've gotten a great deal of research that provides strong support for Professor Alexander's hypothesis. For example, Katrin Amundsen and her colleagues taking slices through the human brain, the occipital cortex at the back of the brain, find you can take a slice through a human brain, hold that slide up to the light, and say without error whether that piece of human brain came from a man or a woman, because the organization of HOC5, the area of the brain looking for speed and direction, is so radically different in the female brain compared to the male brain, and there is no overlap between the sexes. Many other studies like that. But why do girls slightly prefer dolls over trucks? Because the doll has a more interesting color and texture, Professor Alexander argues. Why do juvenile males, whether human, chimpanzee, or monkey, greatly prefer to play with a dull gray truck rather than a colorful doll? Because it moves. It goes kaboom. It's got wheels. All right. Well, why should you care? You're thinking, this might be of interest if I were a neuroscientist interested in sex differences in the visual system, but I am not. I'm a parent with a child. How is all this talk about M and P going to help me with my child? Well, I want you to imagine that you have a child, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years of age, and you give your child a blank sheet of white paper and a box of crayons. And you tell your child, draw whatever you want. What do kids draw? I cite 5 studies in which researchers did just that. Give girls and boys a blank piece of white paper and a box of crayons and ask them to draw whatever they want. One from the United States, one from England, one from South Africa, one from Japan, and one from Thailand. In every case, the girls choose to draw people, pets, flowers, or trees. Typically 2, 3, or 4 arranged on a horizontal ground. The people have eyes, mouth, hair, and clothes. The girls use 10 or more crayons with a predominance of red, orange, yellow, green, beige, and brown. And this is true for essentially every girl, even the tomboy, the girl who hates dolls and would much rather play basketball. She is still drawing a picture of a human figure with colors, eyes, clothes on a horizontal ground. What do boys draw? Well, boys form a bimodal distribution of variance, which is highly crotatic and skewed, which is a fancy way of saying that boys form 2 clumps, one big clump and one small clump. The small clump of boys, about 1 in 12 boys in each of these 5 studies, fewer than 10%, draw pretty much what the girls draw. They draw people, pets, and trees with clothes. People have clothes. Turns out that boys who draw people, pets, and trees have a lot in common with other boys who draw people, pets, and trees. They're at least 3 times more likely to have allergies, asthma, or eczema compared to boys who do not draw people, pets, or trees. They may be athletic, but they're not playing football or soccer or ice hockey. They're playing tennis, track, or golf because they don't like to hit and they don't like to be hit. And so they're much more likely to become victims of bullying because a favorite game among 12-year-old boys, one boy says to the other one, "Hey, how about I hit you as hard as I can, and then you hit me as hard as you can?" And this boy will say, "But I don't want to hit you, and I don't want you to hit me." And he runs off and boom, marks himself as a victim of bullying. He is not more likely to be gay. Here we have Justin and Matthew. Justin likes to play football, likes to hit and be hit. Justin turns out to be gay. Matthew doesn't like football or soccer, doesn't like to hit or be hit, would much rather draw a picture of a flower. Matthew turns out to be straight. The binaries do not align. Gender is complex. But just because gender is complex doesn't mean it doesn't matter. For the remainder of our time together this morning, when I talk about boys, I will not be talking about boys like Matthew, who draw people, pets, and trees. That's the topic for a different presentation on gender atypical boys. For the remainder of our time, when I talk about boys, I will be talking about the more than 90% of boys who do not draw people, pets, or trees. More than 90% of boys given a blank piece of paper and a box of crayons try to draw a scene of action at a moment of dynamic change, like a monster eating an alien or a rocket smashing into a planet. Human figures, if present, are often stick figures lacking eyes, mouth, hair, and clothes. It is not a well-organized two-dimensional picture on a horizontal ground. On the contrary, multiple perspectives are imposed on a single two-dimensional image. So for example, this boy has written the word tank, so you know this is a tank shooting at the bombers going down in flames. Then he's turned the picture upside down and written the word died next to this soldier, so you know the soldier has, in fact, died. These differences are robust across race, ethnicity, nationality, household income, family composition, and language spoken at home. None of those factors have any impact on this parameter. I'm not saying those factors don't matter. I'm saying they have no impact on what kids choose to draw. It makes no difference whether this girl is a Japanese girl in Japan or an American girl in the United States. Girls everywhere draw people, pets, flowers, and trees arranged on a horizontal ground that people have eyes, mouth, hair, and clothes. Most boys are drawing something different. Now imagine that you're a teacher working with young children and you're walking around your classroom. You want to encourage every child. And you come to Emily, who did the picture at upper right. You say, "Emily, this is lovely. What are you drawing?" Emily explained, this is her little kitty, this is her little sister, and her sister's friend. And you say to Emily, "Excellent, carry on, well done." Now you come to Jason, who did the picture at lower right, and you say, "Okay, Jason, what are you drawing here?" Jason explains he's trying to draw a car crash at the moment of impact. This car is being crushed between these two. Now you want to encourage the boy, but he's making it rather difficult. You say, look, sweetie, a car crash, that's really violent. People are going to get hurt or injured or paralyzed. And, I don't see any people in your cars. Your cars are all empty. Look at Emily's picture. It's so nice. No one's getting killed or paralyzed. Why do you have to draw something so violent? Why can't you draw something more like Emily? Then come over to Damien, who did the picture at lower left. And you say, great picture, Damien, but you know what? You've got a whole box of colors. Why'd you draw the vehicle same color as the sky? Why don't you use more colors? And Damien, I don't really see any people in your vehicle. Why don't you put some people in there? There's one thing girls and boys are equally good at every age, as near as we can tell, and that's figuring out what you like, figuring out what the grown-ups like. And it doesn't take the boys very long to figure out they're doing it wrong. I was in a second grade classroom in the United States a few years ago, and the teacher said, free time, you can do whatever you want. And the girls, some of the girls were sitting and coloring. One of the boys was running around the room making a buzzing noise, and I got in his way and I stopped him. And I said, how come you don't want to sit and draw? And he said, without hesitation, he said, drawing's for girls. Drawing is for girls. How'd he get that idea? I'm sure the teacher never said that, but you might as well have, because by praising and understanding pictures that are all about color, detail, texture, faces, but not really getting the point of a picture that's all about action, she is unintentionally sending the message that drawing is for girls. The lack of awareness of gender differences has the unintended consequence of reinforcing gender stereotypes. Because this teacher has received no training in the kinds of pictures that girls and boys want to draw, she's got one more boy who's decided that drawing is for girls. Well, how would you do it differently, knowing what you now know about the hardwired differences between the visual systems in males and females? Well, the key I have found is to begin by understanding what is the picture the kid is trying to draw and help him to draw it better. Don't assess the boy's picture from the girl's perspective, just as you should not assess the girl's picture from the boy's perspective. Suppose you were to assess Emily's picture, upper right, from Damien's perspective. How might you evaluate Emily's picture? You'd say, Emily, nothing's happening in your picture. I know. Why don't you have one of them hit the other one? Well, that's a joke. I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm trying to show how silly it is to assess the girl's picture from the boy's perspective. It is just as silly to assess Damien's picture from Emily's perspective, to tell Damien to use more color or to introduce more people. That's not the way you create a better artist. That's the way you destroy an interest in art. You've got to understand what is the picture the boy's trying to draw and help him to draw it better. Turns out that Damien wants to make it look like his vehicle's going fast. So I submit that best practice here would be to say, hey, Damien, I want you to draw some stuff flying off the truck bed and show some sand spitting up from behind the wheels. And Damien will be encouraged. You've got to understand what is the picture the boy's trying to draw and help him to draw it better. So Gerianne Alexander was kind enough to read how I described her work, and she gave me her stamp of approval. That I have correctly understood her work. She agrees that most boys are trying to draw pictures that engage the magnocellular visual system. Most girls are trying to draw pictures that engage the parvocellular visual system. Well, that creates a hypothesis. Namely, that if more parents and teachers understood those differences, you could break down those stereotypes. You could have more boys who love to draw. And that's not a hypothesis. That is a fact. So Margaret Paula Olafsdottir superintends 17 elementary schools across Iceland, kindergarten through grade 8. And she and her teachers know all about the two visual systems in boys and girls. She sent 44 of her teachers from Iceland to Chicago to attend a 2-day workshop I hosted on this topic. She then sent 60 of her teachers from Iceland to Orlando, Florida to attend a 2-day workshop I hosted on this topic. And then at my invitation, she came to speak at a workshop I hosted in Houston. She did a breakout session, which I attended. And she told us that in each of her 17 schools, since the teachers have had this training, when When you tell students, free time, you can do whatever you want. The boy's favorite pastime is drawing. Favorite pastime is drawing. Boys love to draw. Girls love to draw. I don't think there's any innate difference in boys and girls in how much they love to draw. But there's a big difference in what they want to draw. And if you don't understand that, you end up with boys who think drawing is for girls. Got to assess the boy's work from his perspective. What's the picture he wants to draw? Help him to draw it better. But I think this difference in the visual system has greater implications. Boys are more likely than girls to prefer action across the board on average. So an example from my own practice, a 7-year-old boy was lying in wait for his mother. And she returned home and came into the living room, and he jumped up from behind the couch and said, "Bang, bang, 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 you're dead." And Mom said, "Is that really the kind of game you want to play with your mother? You want to pretend that you just shot your mother?" And she told me his face did something funny, and he burst into tears, ran into his bedroom, and closed the door. Don't do that. Don't do that. That's sending all the wrong messages to your son. Best practice for parents. If your son jumps up from behind the couch and says, "Bang, bang, bang, you're dead," a loving parent should say, "Oh, you got me," and fall over dead. Boys who engage in pretend violence are not more likely to be agents of actual violence. They are not. This is well established, and you'll find the data in my book, Boys Adrift. But if you say to your son, "Is that really the kind of game you want to play?" You're telling your son, "I don't like you. I don't like the kind of person you are. I wish you were someone else." And I can tell you, as a medical doctor with 35 years experience, that that will lead to a rupture in the parent-child relationship. So let's move quickly on now to sex differences in hearing. How loud is a sound? Or more precisely, how does the subjective experience of loudness map onto the objective experience of the amplitude of a sound? This was a focus of the research of Professor J.J. Stevens at Harvard University. And he was the first to understand and document that relationship and to formulate this equation, which is now called Stevens' law in psychology, namely that the subjective loudness of a sound is proportional to the physical amplitude of the sound raised to the power n. Stevens called that value the loudness exponent. Everyone since him has called it Stevens n. It is a number always less than 1, and it varies from one person to the next. And it is higher for girls and women on average than it is for boys and men. So one group of researchers found that it was significantly higher for females across the board than it was for males. Another group found an even bigger difference. They found that at the amplitude of normal conversational speech, the value of n for females was 3 times higher than of the value for males. And as these researchers recognize, that means that the average female is going to be more sensitive to a given sound than the average male are. Or put it another way, females will experience that sound as being louder than males do on average. It's actually not a new finding. Almost 50 years ago, Diane McGinnis at Stanford did a study, 25 women, 25 men, looking at sensitivity across the spectrum and obtained what we call equal loudness curves, and found across the spectrum from the lowest pitch to the highest pitch, you have to crank up the sound about 8 decibels for the male to hear it as being as loud as the female. About 8 decibels. That's about 3 clicks on a typical stereo. Colin Elliott in Canada, similar finding for boys. Again, you had to crank up the sound about 9 decibels for the boys to hear it as being as loud as the girls. These are averages. If you're a woman and you live with a man and you share a car with a man, get in the car, turn on the radio, you're like, whoa, he's got that thing cranked up way loud. You're in the living room watching television and turn on the TV and say, whoa, he's got that thing cranked up way loud. You're thinking, whoa, is he deaf? Why does he have it cranked up so loud? Well, perhaps, but more likely he is simply a typical male. And the typical male will turn the sound up about 3 notches on the stereo dial, about 8 decibels compared to the typical woman. What if you're the father of a daughter? Hearing sensitivity declines as a function of age. Old people hear less well than children do. And at every age, males hear less well than females do at every age. So now imagine a 45-year-old father speaking to his 15-year-old daughter. Well, I don't have to imagine because, again, in my own practice, a teenage girl in my own practice complained to me that her father's always shouting at her. So she says, I come home, I go to my bedroom, I close the door because I don't like him shouting at me. So I bumped into the father a few days later and I said, Dad, she'd given me permission to share this with him. I said, your daughter told me that you're always shouting at her. And he said, Dr. Sax, I never once shouted at that girl. You hear what I'm saying to you. I said, yeah, okay, I hear you. And I explained to him about differences in hearing sensitivity, that children have more sensitive hearing than adults, that girls and women have more sensitive hearing than boys and men. And I suggested to him, I said, next time you talk with your daughter, whisper. I mean, not literally whisper, but lower your voice way down. And he agreed to try. And a few weeks later, I bumped into the daughter again. And she said, oh my goodness, my father can actually talk like a normal human being. The lack of awareness of sex differences can drive a father and daughter apart. No one had ever told Dad that an adult man needs to lower his voice when he's speaking to a teenage girl. He's happy to do it. No one had ever suggested that. The lack of awareness of sex differences can drive a family apart. Moving on, Richard Doty and his colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia have studied the ability to smell, olfactory acuity, around the world in women and men. And they find that across human cultures and continents, women have more sensitive smell than men do on average. So when you smell, you sniff the molecules bind to the olfactory receptors, which send their information to the olfactory bulb at the base of the brain. The average woman has 16 million cells in the olfactory bulb, compared to only 9 million in the average man. The average woman has almost 7 million neurons in the olfactory bulb, compared with half that number in the average man. So Patricia Dalton and her colleagues studied how the ability to detect an odor changes with repeated exposure to that odor. And they found that with a repeated exposure, a woman's ability to detect the odor increases by a factor of more than 100,000. How about men? 100,000? No. 1,000? No. 100? No. 10? No. No, there's no change at all for men on average in the ability to detect an odor. That's what her apparatus looks like. This is the log scale. Dramatic improvement in women's ability to detect the odor with repeated exposure, and statistically, no change among men. So let me tell you another story from my own practice. Husband and wife go away during summertime for a 2-week vacation away from their home. They return home after 2 weeks, hot summer, enter their home, go into the kitchen. The woman says, oh my goodness, something died It rotted. I think I'm going to throw up. The man says, I don't smell anything. They both came in to see me, separate visits. The woman said to me, I think my husband is a farm animal because there's this horrible stench in our kitchen. It makes you want to throw up, and he claims he can't smell it. And I explained to the wife, you cannot be angry with him any more than a sighted person can be angry with a blind person. The smell is real. He doesn't smell it. Not because he's being difficult, he doesn't smell it. And the husband came in to talk to me, and he says, my wife's a witch, except he didn't say witch. He used a different word. He said, she's going on and on, saying we have to hire a contractor, rip out the wall, because there's this horrible smell. I don't smell it. I explained to that husband, you cannot argue with her any more than a blind person can argue with a sighted person. The smell is real. It's overpowering. You have to hire the contractor. You know, there's some pastors at churches who will insist on counseling a young man and a young woman before agreeing to marry them, which I think is fine. I think this should be part of that counseling. I think a husband and wife need to understand that there are profound and hardwired differences in the way a man and a woman experience the sensory world in hearing, vision, and smell. So that when your husband says, I don't smell anything, you don't get angry at him. You realize he's telling the truth. If you're a mom and your son's room stinks, you tell him, look, if you ever hope to live with a woman, the standard of cleanliness which will apply is not your standard, but hers. And I would prefer that you not eat in your bedroom, but if you do, the cheese cannot remain under the bed for 3 weeks. You need to promptly return uneaten food to the kitchen and take care of it. You can't leave food under the bed. And the son may very well say, I don't smell anything. He's not being defiant or disrespectful. He's telling you the truth. But you need to explain to him, maybe you can't, but I can. And you need to hold him to a higher standard of cleanliness, not in anger, just understanding the hardwired differences in olfactory acuity between male and female. Again, the lack of awareness of sex differences in the ability to smell can create tension between mother and son, between a wife and a husband. Very quickly, sex differences in language acquisition. So how many words can a child understand and produce at 18 months of age? Researchers at Cambridge University in England studied this question quantitatively, and this is what they found. The average girl at 18 months of age has a vocabulary of about 90 words. The average boy at the same age has a vocabulary of about 40 words. Very dramatic differences between the sexes. Why the differences? Well, there's certainly hardwired differences in brain development, which you'll see in a few slides. Also, girls and boys prefer different activities. Girls are more likely to be involved in face-to-face activities, which involve words and facial expressions. Boys are more likely to do shoulder-to-shoulder activities or tag and chasing activities. If you have an older daughter and a younger son, do not compare. Many times over my 35 years as a physician, I've heard parents express concerns that their younger son seems delayed. I'll give you one example, again, from my own practice. Mother has an 18-month-old son, and she's concerned. She tells me, you know, when my daughter was 18 months old, I could bounce her on my knee, and I'd say gaga goo goo, and she'd say gaga goo goo, and I'd say boo boo bee bee, and she'd say boo boo bee bee, and we could just do that for 20 minutes and crack each other up. We had the most fun just playing that game with sounds. She said, I tried doing that with my son, same age, he's now 18 months old, tried doing it with my son, and somebody rode their bicycle and he's looking over there, and there's a creek and he's looking over there. He's very distractible. She said, and I looked that up on Google, and it said it can be a sign of autism. I'm concerned he may have autism. And I said, well, it can be a sign of autism, but it can also be a sign of being a boy. Boys are more distractible than girls on average. But I could not talk her down. She said, I insist on having him tested. I want you to refer me to a center that specializes in testing children in this age group. I said, all right, the Treatment and Learning Center in Rockville, they're very good. They do play-based testing. They specialize in kids this age. I probably shouldn't have done that. I should have tried harder to talk her out of it. But anyhow, she took him to the Treatment and Learning Center, and she came back in tears. She said, they said he's abnormal. He's below average. They said he doesn't have language. They said the average child, the average 18-month-old has a vocabulary of about 65 words. And they said they estimate his vocabulary is only 40 words. He's below average. And I showed her the graph that the average 18-month-old boy has a vocabulary of 40 words. The average 18-month-old child has a vocabulary of about 65 words. Well, let's see if that's true. 90, which is the average for girls, plus 40, the average for boys, is 130. 130 divided by 2 is 65. So that's a true statement. The average 18-month-old child, averaging between girls and boys, has a vocabulary of about 65 words. It is a true statement. It is also absolutely meaningless because there is no such thing as a child. There are only girls and boys. Well, that's not strictly true. There are some children who are truly intersex, both male and female, or neither male nor female. For example, a chimera, an individual who is an XXXY mix, an equal mix of male and female cells, as can happen if fraternal twins fuse at an early stage in development, which happens in our species with a frequency of about 1 in 2 million live births. That is an intersex child who is both male and female. I wrote a paper for the Journal of Sex Research adding up all intersex conditions, maximum estimate of frequency. You come up with a frequency of 2 in 10,000 live births. In other words, 99.98% of children are either male or female. Intersex is a very rare condition. So for 99.98% of children, a statement about the average child is meaningless. Your norms must be normed to gender. Compare boys to boys and girls to girls. So very quickly, let's talk about sex differences in brain development. The world's largest study of brain development at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, which has been ongoing now for 26 years, where the same child comes in year after year after year and has their brain scanned. That child was 3-year-old when the study began, and that child is now 29 years old. More than 3,000 individuals, 3 through 30 years of age, showing conclusively that the different regions of the brain develop according to different timetables in girls and boys, and the brain overall develops according to a dramatically different timetable. So this is a graph of the volume of the intracranial space in milliliters as a function of age in years. Red is girls, blue is boys. The dashed lines are 95% confidence intervals above and below. The inflection point is roughly the halfway point in brain development. Girls reach the inflection point just before 11 years of age. Boys don't reach the inflection point until just before 15 years of age. That's more than 2 standard deviations of difference separating boys from girls. Girls develop faster than boys do, and it is a dramatic difference. Turns out that sex differences between adults on many parameters are small. What is an adult? Well, the brain research now answers this question, not just the NIH study, but we have many other studies now from Harvard, UCLA, Toronto, many other international studies have looked at brain development across age. We can now say that A girl reaches adult status in terms of brain development by about 22 years of age. Turns out that boys are not mature adults in terms of brain development until about 30 years of age, 30. That explains a lot if you think about it. How long can you sit still, be quiet, and pay attention? There's no difference between adults on that parameter. An adult man can sit still, a 30-year-old man can sit still, be quiet, and pay attention for about as long, on average, as a 22-year-old woman. How long can a 5-year-old boy sit still, be quiet, and pay attention? Compared to a 5-year-old girl, about half as long. I was visiting a school where a teacher said to me, the teacher had allowed a boy to stand up during class, and I asked why. And she said, when that boy sits down, his brain shuts off. It is not unusual to find 5, 6, 7-year-old boys who absolutely have to stand, bounce up and down, and make buzzing noises in order to learn. It is very unusual to find 30-year-old men who absolutely have to stand, bounce up and down, and make buzzing noises in order to learn. Sex differences diminish as a function of age on many of these parameters, not in hearing, but on many of the other parameters. But on ability to pay attention, which is very much a function of brain development, sex differences between girls and boys are huge. And on the parameter of ability to pay attention, there are no differences between adult men and adult women. But girls and boys are different from one another. They are hardwired to be different. You must recognize, respect, and cherish the differences. If you ignore those differences, you're putting both girls and boys at risk. So you'll find much, much more about this in my book, Why Gender Matters. Be sure to get the second edition, published in 2017, a big improvement over the first edition, published in 2005. Most of the research I cite in the second edition didn't exist at the time of the first edition. We've learned a lot about gender. My other books, Boys Adrift, the 5 factors driving the growing epidemic of unmotivated boys and underachieving young men. Girls on the Edge, why we have seen an explosion in anxiety and depression among girls over the past 10 years. The Collapse of Parenting, which, as I mentioned, is available in Spanish. So I prepared a handout for you with most of the graphs in this talk, as well as all the scholarly references. If you'd like to go back and read the research and don't want to bother with my book, you can go straight to the scholarly references. The handout is online. Go to my website, leonardsax.com/WGM. That stands for whygendermatters.pdf. You must include the www and the .pdf. The link is case sensitive and it is all lowercase. If you go to my website, just the homepage, leonardsax.com, I hope you'll consider sharing your email and you'll get my newsletter. I've actually only sent out one newsletter in the last 6 months. I only send something out when I think I have something to say or something to share. And you can also contact me via email through the website. So that's about all I have to say. Partha, did you have any comments or questions? Forcing boys to play with dolls. So I've been involved in many schools that have said, hey, we're not going to allow boys to point fingers at each other saying, bang, bang, you're dead, because we don't want to encourage violence. Instead, we think they should play with dolls. Okay, well, that was a reasonable hypothesis 30 years ago, that maybe encouraging boys to play with dolls rather than trucks or guns would help boys to be more nurturing. But we actually have longitudinal cohort studies now in which researchers have gone into homes. And we have 2 homes, same race, ethnicity, household income, family composition. In one home, they let boys play with trucks and guns. In the home next door, they take away the trucks and the guns and give the boys only dolls to play with. This has been done. And what do we find? Do we find that the boys given only dolls to play with and no trucks and no guns, do they grow up to be more nurturing? No, there's no difference whatsoever. Furthermore, when you look at what the boys do with the dolls, you find that they are not singing lullabies to them. They're not dressing them. They're using the dolls as weapons or projectiles. So insisting that boys play with dolls rather than trucks accomplishes nothing good. And I have become convinced, based on my 35 years experience with families and schools, that it does something bad. When you say to boys, you're not allowed to play with trucks or dolls, you must play, excuse me, you're not allowed to play with trucks or guns, you must play with a doll instead. The message the boy is getting is, you think there's something wrong with me. You think there's something wrong with wanting to play with a truck rather than a doll. That is the unintended message you are sending, and you are breaking the relationship. You are undermining the relationship. And I have counseled many families where the teenage boy will say to his mother, in my presence, you hate me, you've always hated me. And the mother will say, how can you say that? I love you, I've sacrificed so much for you. How can you say that? It's often hard for the boy to articulate it, but I can tell you what his answer is. His answer is, all my life you said you're not allowed to play with trucks, you're not allowed to play with guns, you have to play with dolls. You hate me. I don't want to play with dolls. I want to play with trucks and guns, and you think that's wrong. You find that offensive. So you just hate who I am. Fine, I hate you too. Insisting that boys play with dolls rather than trucks accomplishes nothing good. We can say that with certainty based on the evidence. And I believe, based on my firsthand experience, that it does a lot of bad things, that it undermines the relationship between parent and child. Probably my most popular workshop that I have led, and which I have led incidentally in Monterrey, in Ciudad Mexico, in Guadalajara, in San Luis Potosi, is for teachers specifically on how you create gender-aware instructional strategies for girls and for boys. There is no difference in the content. You can teach physics and computer programming to girls and they will master it, at least as well as the boys do. But you must teach it differently. The best way to get girls excited about physics and computer science is different from the best way to get boys excited about physics and computer science. You can teach boys foreign languages and poetry just as well as you can teach it to girls, and the boys will learn it at least as well as the girls learn it, but you must teach it differently. The best way to get boys excited about foreign language and about poetry is different from the best way to get girls excited about foreign languages and poetry. And when I lead these workshops for schools, I share these strategies which can be deployed in the co-ed classroom. You do not need single-sex classrooms to deploy these, but you must understand the differences. And the problem is most teachers have had no training in this. They have no clue what the differences are, and no one has ever instructed them. And you can't expect teachers to come up with all this on their own. And I didn't come up with this on my own. I have visited now over 460 schools. I have learned from teachers by sitting in the classroom how you get boys excited about poetry and history, and how radically different that is from how you get girls excited about poetry and history. And I'm tempted to launch into an example, but that's from the workshop for teachers. So I have 5 days, 35 hours of strategies that I share for every content area and every age group, K through 12.
Okay. And for more information about that, can they enter your website? They
Absolutely.
Can find it there?
Yeah. If you go to leonardsax.com and click on workshops, you'll see a detailed description of that workshop for teachers, the Why Gender Matters workshop for teachers, which is very different from the Why Gender Matters workshop for parents. if you have some money and you want to buy your kid a toy, let them choose the color of the toy. Don't choose it for them because there's great variation. We didn't have time today to go into the variations. And I have learned the hard way that when I do this short workshop for parents, some parents think I'm saying that all boys are one way and all girls are another way, even though I've been careful to say the average boy, the average girl. There's a lot of variation among girls. A lot of girls hate dolls. A lot of girls hate shopping. A lot of girls hate pink. A lot of boys hate football and would rather write a poem or draw a picture of a flower. So there's a lot of variation, and the variations are meaningful and significant and not random. We didn't have time to get to that. But again, if I can promote my book, Why Gender Matters. Why Gender Matters has 12 chapters. The last 4 chapters are on gender nonconforming. Gender nonconforming means the boy who hates football, the girl who hates dolls. Gender nonconforming, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex. So that's 4 out of 12 chapters of the book devoted to kids who don't fit the stereotypes. So you have to recognize that a lot of kids don't fit the stereotypes. That's great. The variety of the human experience is very rich. And we don't want to push girls and boys into pink and blue cubbyholes. The last chapter of the book has a section titled Beyond Pink and Blue. Everyone needs to find their own balance. As a parent, you need to help your child find that balance, but you shouldn't force pink on girls. You shouldn't force blue on boys, for sure.
Muchas gracias, Leonard, por esta gran conferencia que sin duda nos deja un aprendizaje que podemos trabajar día a día con nuestras hijas y nuestros hijos. Esperamos pronto tenerte de vuelta en Núcleo Familiar. Y queremos invitar a todos los que nos acompañan a visitar nuestra página web para que sigan conociendo nuestra causa y todo el contenido que tenemos para sus familias. Les estaremos informando sobre nuestras próximas conferencias a través de nuestras redes sociales. Nos vemos pronto, buenas noches y recuerden que juntos formamos familias fuertes.